Hello, I'm Anne Blanford, and today I'm going to talk about disrupting search constructively. And I hope that soon enough that title will become clear. The structure of my talk is that I'm going to first talk about how we engage with information and particularly focus on the information journey as a way of thinking about that. I'll then talk at much more length about how we encounter information, particularly how we experience serendipity, how encountering is ambient and can be personalised, and how people invest often in future information encounters. And I'll close by talking about how we design for encountering with new technology. So, classic information retrieval, information search kind of focus on the small picture, on the core of the technology and the process of search. Taking a slightly broader perspective, information seeking looks much more at the process by which information is discovered over perhaps an extended interaction between a user and information resources. The information journey, which is my focus today, takes yet a broader perspective, sets that within the context of people's lives and the broader ways that they encounter, work with, search for, use information. The information journey is described in detail in our book, which is now several years old. But broadly, it consists of four key stages. Firstly, recognizing a need. People actively search, intentionally search, when they're aware that there's some information gap, some need that they have, and they choose information resources to address that information need. So the second step is finding information, using online resources, perhaps engaging with experts, talking to other people, reading books, reading articles, etc. Those tend to be the areas that are most classically focused on in information research and information seeking. But the other stages are equally important. The third stage is validating and interpreting information. Information is somehow abstract. People need to make it real, make it personal, interpret what it means for them, check that they consider it to be valid and that it's credible to them. And ultimately, the reason for acquiring information is to use that information, to use the interpretation of information, whether that's just to build understanding or whether it is to write a report, prepare for a legal case, do a clinical diagnosis, many, many different reasons for which we might use information in our daily lives. But another really important aspect of working with information is that we often encounter it. We come across useful information without necessarily seeking it. It might be immediately important. So, for me, one example happened a few years ago when the alarm went off in a hotel in the middle of the night. And this photo is taken when we were all standing out in the car park. You can just about make the fire engine out in the middle of the picture. I wasn't looking for information at that time about fires or possible fires, but I heard the alarm. I interpreted what that meant. I used that information to tell myself to get out of bed and find my way to a place of safety. Some other times you might encounter information and its use will only become apparent sometime later. If you accept this view that encountering and seeking are both important, then it's an important design challenge to develop and deliver resources that actually support all the phases of the information journey. That information retrieval phase is important, but it's a part of a much bigger picture. Such resources shouldn't lock users in We don't always use the same resources. We don't rely just on one channel of communication. We use a whole ecology of tools to support our information needs and the ways that we work with information. So resources should empower people to engage with information more effectively. And that should also recognise that the ways that we interact with information are situated within our broader activities, our social environments, our physical environments. There are sometimes emotional aspects to it, and they take place at particular times and in particular places. When we think about information encountering, what does that mean? Well, the dictionary definition of an encounter is an unexpected or casual meeting with someone or something. In particular, serendipity, a kind of positive encounter, is the faculty or phenomenon of finding valuable or agreeable things that have not been sought for, or the occurrence and development of events by chance in a happy or beneficial way. And I've included this little picture because the term serendipity is based on the story of the princes of Serendip, to whom a series of positive things happened on their journey. Why is it interesting to design for encountering and serendipity? Well, as we move from physical information resources much more towards digital resources, with search and with using recommendations that are closely linked to past activity, that means that people risk encountering only information that reinforces their existing worldview and that is entirely consistent with what they already know. It never allows people to think outside the box, to, to foster creativity, to discover things which are outside their immediate comfort zone. So one of the challenges that we've been trying to address is how to design for positive encounters, whether those are based on ambient information or personalised information, so that we can extend the range of kinds of interaction with information that people experience. One of the unfortunate bases of this is that we have to disrupt people's interactions in a constructive way. Just giving people more and more information just leads to information overload most of the time. And we're trying to avoid that. We don't want people to just feel overwhelmed. We want people to find it a creative and positive experience. And in order to do that, you have to understand the rules of what makes information encountering positive in order to make disruptions to people's existing patterns of engagement effective, working. And that's exemplified by some artists, such as Picasso, um, who learned how to paint, how to create artworks in a fairly traditional way before working out how to violate rules, how to create beautiful artworks that actually did not just reflect the real world in a very kind of realistic way. So we're trying to do kind of something analogous with engaging with information. So we started by trying to understand the experience of serendipity. We did that by starting with the present, trying to understand what that experience feels like. We conducted a series of interviews with researchers from a range of different disciplines. We conducted diary studies where people kept a record of experience that they had had which they regarded as serendipitous. And with all this qualitative data, we did a rich data analysis, not aiming to define the word serendipity. In a sense, that's not what we were trying to do. Dictionary definitions already exist. But to understand the kind of interactive experiences that we're aiming to facilitate in designing new serendipitous kinds of interactive experiences with technology. People gave us lots of stories. An example is an architect who told us a story of how she was working and then she broke off from work to watch The Daily Show. And it just so happened that a geologist was being interviewed on that show, talking about tube worms, which live in the depths of the ocean and where two creatures have a symbiotic relationship, living together side by side and working incredibly closely together. And that story gave her an idea for the building that she was working on at the time about using those kinds of concepts to construct features in the building. The full story is available on YouTube if you care to follow up on that. So we developed an account of the process of experiencing a serendipitous encounter as consisting of the following key stages. Firstly, making a new connection, encountering new information, and recognizing that it relates to something important that you're already interested in. That requires unexpected circumstances and an insight to make that new connection. Typically, people will project the potential value of the outcome. Oh, this information is useful because, and then exploit that connection, reflect on what was experienced. Was the outcome valuable? Was it at some level unanticipated? And reflect then on the value of the outcome, while also thinking about how unexpected the circumstances that led to that connection might have been. And if all these things hold, then people consider this to be serendipity. It's about unexpectedness and insight and value. Long before we conducted that study, we had unwittingly had an earlier study where ambient encountering turned out to be really important. In this study, we found a situation where information was often valued as being timely and relevant. It featured an awareness server that had been implemented in a hospital. It had been designed to hide sensitive information from clinical screens when people weren't actually working directly with that information. So after a period of inactivity, this awareness server would launch and show information about things that were going on within the hospital. And we found that it became valued by staff in its own right, not just for its ability to hide information, but also because of the information that it was sharing. We tried to understand why people were so enthusiastic about this feature. And in interviewing people and analysing that data, we found 4 key things that were important about it. Firstly, it appeared when people were having kind of downtime, when they were stopping for a conversation, to have a cup of tea, to take a break from the work that they'd been engaged in. So they were kind of slightly more open to being informed about other things than they might have been had they been working intensely on something. It didn't actively demand their attention, it was just there. They could look at it or they could ignore it. It was bite-sized, i.e. small amount of information, easily consumed. And it was contextually relevant to the people in that organisation, i.e. it was about the organisation. It wasn't about random world events or random things that were related to other people. It was relevant to the people in that context. And these are key ideas about what might make encountered information valuable. In trying to take a lot of those ideas and actually explicitly design to support personalised encounters with information, we developed the concept of a notebook, a serendipity notebook. Here, the idea was that we would take an individual's interests as expressed through the notes that they were creating and offer up kind of tangential suggestions of ideas to explore or resources to investigate. And of course, the rules about what makes something tangential are important rules. This is not, something that is really, really obvious, because that is not interesting in many ways. People can find those kinds of things already. It's about the things that are relevant, but not immediately and very directly relevant. So, since such a concept is quite hard to implement in reality, as an early investigation, we did a Wizard of Oz study. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the idea of a Wizard of Oz study, but that name is based on the kind of famous children's novel. And the idea is that rather than actually having a really clever computer system or piece of technology, we have a person who is impersonating such a piece of technology. And in this study, we had 4 people trained as wizards. These people underwent very detailed training, and they had a set of serendipitous rules that gave them guidance on how to generate suggestions for the participants in the study. And the wizards kept a detailed log of their activities, the decisions they'd made, the rules that they'd applied, the messages that they had sent as a consequence of applying those rules. And we had 20 study participants who used the app, the Serene Notebook app, for 10 days. Each of these participants received 3 suggestions from one of the wizards every day. And they rated those suggestions and reported on whether or not they followed up on any of the suggestions through a debriefing interview that we held with them after the study. So the 3 criteria on which the participants rated suggestions were whether it was unexpected, interesting, and whether or not they followed up on it. We classed any suggestions that were rated as somewhat or very unexpected, interesting, etc., on all of these dimensions as pseudo-serendipity. And this rating applied to 73 of the 600 suggestions that were issued during the time period of the study, and 19 of the 20 participants reported having at least one of these kind of pseudo-serendipity encounters. We call it only pseudo-serendipity rather than full serendipity because we weren't in a position to actually check whether the outcome was positive, just whether or not people anticipated that it would be positive and whether or not they followed up on it. So just one example of that kind of pseudo-serendipity was that the wizard to one participant suggested, "Do you know that the record shop in Amersham now stocks Warhammer products?" and provided a link to the shop. And the participants commented, "It really was incredibly pertinent, useful information that seemed quite miraculous, and it was timely, it just happened. I followed it up by sticking my nose in there," into the shop, in other words. And that's just one of many examples. In analysing all the reports and the outcomes from the debrief interviews, we identified a set of factors that influenced how people responded to these suggestions that they received. Firstly, there were some which were directly related to the information journey, like what kind of content it was. That example was about Warhammer. About how the information was phrased. Did it support people in making a connection to their interests? What was the information source? Was it a credible source of information that the link pointed to? What kind of information was it? Was it about their social life, their social interests? Was it perhaps about the work? Was it about how did it relate to their workload at the time, and what time of day did it take place? But we also identified a set of factors which linked directly to how open they were to serendipity at that time, which of course relates indirectly to the time of day and to their workload, but also to where they were, their physical situation, what activities they were engaged in, and the focus of their thinking at the time. So, did the suggestion that came in catch them at a time when they were open to serendipity? And was it easy enough for them to make the connection to other things that they were interested in? So, just to summarize that, whether people respond to suggestions depends on how relevant the suggestion is and how interesting it is, but also on the time at which the suggestion arrives. It only really makes a difference if it arrives at a time when the individual is open to a kind of positive distraction from what they're doing otherwise. In a related study, we looked at how people use social media and how they experience serendipity in a social media context. And in this study, we worked particularly with postgraduate students, using semi-structured interviews and analysing that data using thematic analysis. This was a comparatively small study conducted by a master's student. And one of the things that she found was that other students using social media very consciously invested time in encountering information, in making serendipitous encounters possible within information space. So they talked about browsing when they were taking a break. So being relaxed, being open to exploration, just exploring more or less in a more or less directed way. They reported following relevant people on social media so that they would pick up potentially interesting ideas through the people that they followed. They reported investing time in creating social media and in consuming social media, so making it a dialogue with other people through different forms of social media. But also, people recognise that there's trade-offs that they're making. They talked of being sidetracked, of perhaps wasting time, getting distracted, and having to apply a certain amount of self-discipline to make all this work for themselves. And the final study I'm going to talk about is one where we sought to understand the strategies of creative professionals. The picture I've included here is of the sea, and it reflects one of the stories that a chef told us. He reported standing on the beach one day, looking out to sea, looking at the rocks and the waves crashing, and developing an idea for a new way of cooking fish that involved soaking them in rock salt. That chef was just one participant across a range of different creative professionals. We worked with artists, actors, directors, chefs, other kinds of creative professionals. And again, did a rich qualitative analysis focusing on their personal strategies of creating serendipitous occasions for themselves. And what we found was that they reported varying their routines, being very consciously observant of things around themselves, creating mental space for themselves, relaxing their boundaries, and doing things that were perhaps a little bit out of the ordinary, almost routinely, drawing on their previous experiences and looking for patterns quite consciously. And these help them to make connections, and for the last two of these, it helped them also to project the value of the connections, to anticipate why they might be useful. And then, of course, they had to exploit the value of the connections by seizing opportunities. It's no good just having an insight if you don't then do something with it. So examples of strategies that people fostered include encouraging people to vary their routine and relax their boundaries by proposing novel suggestions, creating awareness of new possibilities, encouraging people to think outside the box, to do new things, to explore new avenues. Encouraging observation by drawing attention to changes. or perhaps challenging assumptions so that people are encouraged to think outside the normal tramlines. Facilitating mental space through tools like mindfulness and other kinds of creativity tools. And so on, many different kinds of ways of helping people to think more creatively, to have more serendipitous experiences with information. So, what have we learned? We've thought about designing for encountering and particularly tailoring to the individual situation at the time of the encounter. We've recognised that we need not just technical solutions, but actually socio-technical solutions that are designed to help people to make connections. And we've recognised that we need to empower people, to support them on journeys that encourage people to be insightful and creative and use information in new ways. Thank you for listening, and thank also to my colleagues with whom I've worked over many years, including these people listed here, to the funders of my studies, and of course to the organisers of the conference. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye.